The Gut Republic, a tale of fermentation, fortification, and the flora within. The gut at war. The smell hit you before you saw anything. Not the good kind of smell, not the warm, yeasty perfume of a living civilization going about its business. This was sharp, sulphurous bite of something rotting within. The kind of smell that if you were a bacterium born in a lining of a large intestine, you would recognize immediately as the smell of trouble. Celine Lactobacillus pressed herself flat against the gut wall and listened. She was compact, well, as compact as a rod-shaped bacterium could be, with a posture that communicated quite clearly that she had survived worse than this. Her colony coat had a deep indigo, the color of La Bonne Fleur, that had worn as long as anyone could remember. She adjusted it now, pulling the collar up against her sour wind rolling in from the lower gut. "Protein," she whispered, "are you there?" A few micrometers away, hunched behind a fold of the gut lining, came the reply. "Oui, je suis là." Perry Protein crawled forward to his thick, coiled arms, built a dock worker, dense and purposeful, with nitrogen tags running up his sleeves like a sergeant's stripes. His job, as he often explained with considerable passion, was construction, repair, the unglamorous but essential work of keeping everything standing. I count 47 classifidia units advancing from the upper colon, maybe more. Celine closed her eyes. 47. 6 months ago, that number would have been unthinkable. It had begun gradually, and then all at once. First, the fibers stopped coming, the great shipments of complex carbohydrates, the food that fed the good colonies, thinned to a trickle. Without it, the beneficial bacteria began to starve and thin out. And then the antibiotic floods had swept through twice in a single season, wiping out everything indiscriminately. The good bacteria, with their careful infrastructure and slow growth, suffered more. The bad bacteria simply waited, and in the vacuum, they had arrived. The despotic front, called simply the Russians by the residents of La Bonne Fleur, on account of their grim collectivist efficiency and their fondness for bureaucratic cruelty, had been building their forces in the upper colon for months. Their leader was a large, slick-coated rod by the name of General Glabisia Vladimirovich. He had arrived in the gut during a particular ill-advised fast food binge 7 months ago and had been consolidating power ever since. He wore a gleaming red coat and the expression of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the weakness of his opponents. The good bacteria had fallen back to the small intestine junction. Hurry said quietly, reading dispatches from the bile salt runners. Thin, fast-moving cells who knew the gut's geography better than any map. The entire middle colon is compromised. "And fatty?" Celine asked. Barry hesitated. Fatty is in negotiations. Fabeline Fatty Leptiae was, in the opinion of everyone who knew her, the most complicated person in the gut. She was tall as a fat molecule could stand, which was considerable, with a long, unhurried quality to her movement, as though she was particularly suspended in some thick, which, to be fair, she was. She moved through the gut's watery environment with a practiced ease that suggested a very long relationship with the water's reluctance to accept her. She wore her fatty acid chains like a long cape, and she held the unsettled ability to make herself either extremely visible or completely invisible depending on what she needed from the moment. She also had contacts on both sides, which was in the current climate either an asset or liability, and nobody was quite sure which. Right now she was sitting in a cramped pocket of digestive food near the upper small intestine, across the low membrane from a mid-ranking officer of the despotic front, a bloated, gas-producing type named Kazimir Ivanov Fermentis, whose breath was mostly methane and whose political opinions were mostly propaganda. "The general," said the commissioner Fermentis, adjusting his lapel pin, is prepared to offer your faction as protection status. You operate freely, no disruption to your work. You provide certain services we need, and in return, Fatty said pleasantly, I hope you absorb the nutrients you need to fuel your expansion. I become your delivery system. She smiled. It was a smile that had disarmed more than one signaling receptor in its time. No? Fermentus blinked. He understood the alternative. Of course. She stood, smoothing her coat. I've understood the alternative for 6 weeks. Madame Lepai, Vermis voiced back in a harder edge, you of all people should be practical. You know how to work on both sides of the membrane. The General respects that. The General respects usefulness, Fatty said eventually, and my usefulness to him would be exactly as long as it took him to figure out he didn't need me anymore. She tilted her head. I've been in this gut long enough to know how that ends. Vermis leaned forward. We are winning. You're ahead, she said. There's a difference. She moved towards the membrane exit. Come find me when you understand what the difference is. You can't maintain this neutrality, he called her after her. Nobody can. Nobody in the gut at war. Fatty paused without turning around. You know what the wonderful thing about lipids is, Commissioner? We can cross any barrier we choose. The question is never whether we can cross. The question is which side we cross to. She dissolved through the membrane and was gone. Meanwhile, Sixville up and running hard, Carb was having his own problems. Carlo Carb Glucio was, depending on who you asked, either the gut's most essential citizens or the most catastrophically misunderstood one. He was a man of considerable energy, visibly, electrically so, the kind of person who processed information at a rate that alarmed people and solved problems with a creative recklessness that alarmed them further. He was made primarily of sugar chains, and he wore them as both as identifying and purpose, and he refused to apologize for it. The problem is not that all carbs were the same. The war had made the fat deeply, urgently political. I keep telling them, Carlos said, half running alongside Celine as if they moved through a small intestine corridor. Simple and complex are not the same thing. You can't lump us all together. Carlo, Celine said, as though the plain sugar and the fiber chains are the same. Carlo. What? She grabbed his arm, pulled him behind her villus, 30 meters ahead. A Clausina parole. They've been through the gut lining, attacking the intestinal wall with grim efficiency of a hostile takeover. Carlo pressed flat against beside her. The simple sugars are feeding them, he breathed. The flying ones, they've been defecting for weeks. Not on purpose, they're just burned fast, and the bad bacteria eat them first. I know, Celine said. It's not their fault. They spike and they're gone, and in the crash, Carlo, she looked at him sadly. He had a way when upset or becoming very small inside all the energy, like a fire worried it was burning the wrong things. I know the difference between you and them. Right now, the important thing is survival. She paused. Prairie needs fiber. The good colony needs something to eat. Slow burning, resistant kind that makes you all the way to that large intestine. Can you do that? Carl looked at the parole moving through the lining. He thought about it. Simple sugars, his cousins, metabolically identical to the untrained eye, freely feeding the enemy with thoughtless enthusiasm molecules that have never learned to resist. Yes, he said quietly. I can do that. The briefing took place at what was past for dawn, the quiet hour before the first meal of the day, and the gut was briefly, and probably, still. They met in the appendix. The appendix, for long dismissed by the outside world as pointless, was in fact the gut's republic's most important reserve. It was where the beneficial colonies kept their backed-up population through every catastrophe. It was where the memory of the healthy gut perished, in patience and intact. Celine had always loved it for this. It was the proof that even in the worst moments, something was being kept safe. Paris was already there. His protein chains folded in a way that meant he was worried, but trying not to show it. Fatty arrived slipping through the narrow entrance of the fluid ease that still, after everything, made Celine vaguely envious. Color came last, slightly out of breath, carrying a small chain of prebiotic fiber. he liberated from a recent batch of oats. Right, said Celine. She spread a map across the appendix floor. Here's where we are. The despotic front controls the upper colon and advancing through the middle. The good bacteria are holding the small intestines but barely. The colonies are in the lower colony and are down to about 30% capacity. She paused. If they reach the rectal lining, it's over. Not metaphorically, clinically. A silence filled the appendix. What do we need? Perry asked. We need to feed the good ones, Fatty said. She was not by nature a military thinker, but she had been watching this war longer than anyone. Not weapons, food. The good colonies aren't losing because they lack the will to fight. They're losing because they're starving. Feed them and they'll outgrow the bad ones. That's just biology. The biology, General Valnikrit's voice from directly behind them, is unfortunately no longer your primary concern. They spun. 6 Calabrese soldiers had come through the appendix wall, one direction no one had been watching. They stood in a loose semicircle, weapons drawn, redcoats gleaming. The general himself was enormous, not loudly, in a quieter, more genuine, dangerous way of something that has been simply grown very large by surviving everything that tried to stop it. He looked at the 4 of them with the patience, expressionless assessment of a man for whom was not a drama, but an administrative task. You will come with us, he said, all 4. Celine looked at her people. Carlos' chains were vibrating. Pereira's fists were closed. Fatty's face was composed in a way that meant she was thinking about 7 things simultaneously and already decided something. General, Fatty said, one question before we go anywhere. Vladimir Miskoretz, he tilted his head a fraction. How long do you think this will last? She said. You've taken the colon, you've pushed back the good bacteria, the gut lining is inflamed, the mucus layer is thinning, and the host is in pain. She let that settle. And when the host is in pain, they'll change something. They'll eat differently, or they'll take something, or they'll go to the doctor, and then everything resets. Pause. You know what I mean? You've been through a reset before? We all have. Something the general's expression shifted. Not much, but enough. Take them to the sequel compound, he said finally. An execution, a pause, a negotiation deferred. It was, in this circumstance, the best they were going to get tonight. The healthy gut. It had been a time, not so long ago, in the reckoning of things that lived in the intestines, that when the gut republic had been magnificent. To understand the war, you had to understand the peace. Not as nostalgia. Celine was deeply suspicious of nostalgia, which was considered a form of political incompetence, but as a working blueprint. Because the thing about a healthy gut was that it wasn't simply the absence of disease. It was a positive, active, teeming, and probably complex achievement. It was civilization. The morning routine had begun at 6, with the first wave of movement pushing food through. Partially digested proteins broke down fats, carbohydrate chains, all arriving in organized waves like cargo ships entering a harbor. Fatty lipid would be at the entrance to meet them, directing fat-soluble nutrients to their appropriate channels with focused ease of a harbor master who generally loved her work. Vitamins A, D, E, and K to preserve the lining, she would call out. Omega-3 to the anti-inflammatory team. And someone tell the bile salts that they're doing an excellent job today because honestly, look at this. Magnifique. The bile salts, who were accustomed to compliments, would glow slightly pink. But Fatty's most interesting work, the work she really advertised, happened on the other side of the harbor. General Vladimir, even in his peaceful years, had maintained a small operation of the upper colon. He was always testing edges, always looking for an opening, and Fatty, who had read both sides of the membrane better than anyone, had made her informal business to keep him occupied. She would arrange deliveries, not secretly. She was not a spy. She was an opportunist, strategically. A modest shipment of low-quality fats, stripped of their nutrient value, sent towards the despotic front territory, just often enough to keep Varutovich people busy processing it, metabolizing it, arguing about what to do with it. Small, harmless projects, bureaucratic distractions. The general, she had observed, was a dangerous family when bored and unfed, so she made sure she was always slightly busy. "You're playing a very delicate game," Selene had told her once, watching one of these deliveries move towards the cecal margins. "I'm doing what the lipids do," Fatty said, without looking up, moving things from one place to another and hoping they land somewhere useful. A pause. "He knows, by the way. He's always known. We've never pretended otherwise." Selene had thought about it for a long time. She still wasn't sure if it was the genius or reckless. She suspected Fatty would say it didn't matter as long as it worked. Prairie Protein's operation was a wonderful behold. He ran what was called La Détière, the workshop, from a station in the upper small intestine, overseeing the breakdown and reconstruction of incoming proteins with the focused intensity of a craftsman who considered sloppiness a moral failing. His colleagues broke the incoming chains into individual building blocks called amino acids, and Prairie would direct the reconstruction. This is one for the muscle repair, this one for making digestive enzymes, this one for the immune system's standing order, and this one for the chemical signals the gut sent to the brain. "Trimethophan?" He would say, holding the amino acid, something close to reverence. "This one goes to the serotonin line. Handled with care. 90% of the body's serotonin is made right here in this gut." He would look around at the team. "We're not just a digestive organ. We're building the person above us. Every day." His team had heard the speech many times, found it no less true for their repetition. What Perry didn't advertise was the quiet worry he carried about the war years ahead. The repairs he was making now, the epithelial patches, the enzyme reconstructions. He sometimes thought of it as a letter to his future self. Hold here, rebuild this. Don't let this junction go. A craftsman's note left in the walls of the thing that he was building. And then there was Carlo. In the healthy gut, Carlo Collustio was everywhere and unavoidable, the source of approximately 40% of all arguments and 100% of all the energy. He arrived with each meal in various forms: simple sugars sprinting ahead, complex carbohydrate chains lumbering behind, resistant starches traveling to the dignified pace of things that would value both diminished at the time. The simple sugars were absorbed quickly in the small intestine, feeding the cells above. Carlo made his peace with this. It was their nature, their function. But his favorites were the complex ones, the resistant starches, the long fiber chains that made it way to the large intestine, where the real fermentation happened. Come, he would say, herding the prebiotic chains through the intestine junction like a shepherd that was also extremely caffeinated. The good bacteria are waiting. This is where you fulfill your destiny. And the fermentation would begin. The sound of it, if the bacteria was said to experience sound, was arguably something like music. The rhythmic process of the colonic bacteria consuming complex carbohydrate and producing short-chain fatty acids by its byproduct. Bularate, propionate, acetate. These were fermentation processes fed by the colony's own cells, kept the gut lining intact, and sent signals to the immune system saying, all is well, the wall holds, the republic stands. Labonflorates administered this with the characteristic thoroughness. The lactobacillus division handled the small intestine, producing lactic acid and natural antibiotics that would be invaders in the check. The bifidobacterium managed the fermentation work in the large intestine. The Akers Mansinia kept the protective mucus layer thick and impermeable. And the fecal bacterium, the Republic's most important infrastructure engineers, whose names even Carlo couldn't pronounce without gesturing, produced bularate and quantities that kept the gut lining in the state of perpetual well-fed satisfaction. It was any objective measure of functioning civilization. There were disagreements, competing bacterial factions and ancient territorial disputes requiring periodic mediation, and the question of how many of Carlo's simpler relatives should be permitted in the small intestines would authorize were a perennial political tension. There were the productive disagreements of a living society. Even General Vlad Moskowitz faction existed in those days, a small, closely watched population in the upper colon, held in check by the competition, acid, and the fatty's quiet management. They grumbled. They sent petitions. They were, in the healthy gut, more or less harmless. The good bacteria simply outgrew them, outcompeted them, produced acids that they couldn't tolerate. It was not required perfection, it was required more of anything else feeding. That's what I miss most, Paris said quietly. They were in the cecal compound, not quite a prison, but a very secure and very uncomfortable holding area. The walls were thick with bad bacterial coating, and the air tasted of gas and political disappointment. When the proteins arrived correctly and had everything they needed for even repair, there was never even backlog. The queue was always clear. I miss the fermentation, Carlos said. He said, sitting in his arms around his knees, the first time Celine had seen him not in motion. And when the resistant starches came through in volume, I could hear the colonies working, properly fed, properly running. He shook his head. That sound, you don't know what you have until it's gone. Fatty said nothing for a while. She was watching the Clycidic guards pace outside the wall. She was thinking about the delivery she used to arrange, the small distractions shipments, the harmless bureaucratic project she handed Vlad Merkurich to keep him busy. She hadn't even done it out of altruism. She'd done it because she had understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the most dangerous thing about a bad bacteria wasn't their strength, it was their boredom. I should have accelerated sooner, she said finally. Celine looked at her. The signals were there. The fiber declining, the pH creeping up, the mucus layer thinning. Fatty turned from the wall. I could read every one of those. I was reading them. I just kept thinking, one more week, one more adaptation, one more small intervention. She paused. Here's the thing that happens to fat molecules in a cold environment. We thicken, we slow, we stop flowing. She looked at her hands. I think it did that. Not physically, but I slowed when I should have moved. It was a personal thing Celine had ever heard, Fatty said. She didn't know what to say back, so she said honestly, I miss things too. The sneak attack. The plan was Fatty's, which surprised everyone, including Fatty, who considered herself a strategist of markets and membranes rather than of military operations. But 3 days in the cecal compound had given her time to think, which was, she later reflected, probably the general's mistake. She shared it first with Celine at the moment when the Clycidic guards were occupied with a minor territorial dispute between the digestive front and the sub-fractions, who had, in the absence of external enemies, began arguing amongst themselves. The mucus layer, Fatty said quietly, it's the key. The Acromancina, they're the ones who build and maintain the mucus wall, and the spotic front can't eliminate them entirely. They live in the mucus itself. And if they're still there, the layer isn't gone, just thin. She paused. Thin can be repaired. Repaired with what? We have no fiber, no. Boularate, Fatty said. Boularate is the fuel that feeds the mucus spinning process. The boularate comes from fermentation, and fermentation, she looked at Carlo, had been focusing the expression of someone recognizing the end of a sentence they've been waiting for. Fermentation needs fiber, Carlo finished, and I know where the fiber is. It had come during the night. The morning's delivery had included, among the usual processed food in the gut the public had come in regards of resigned despair, a single anonymous shipment. Mixed legumes, chickpeas, lentils, black beans, high in resistant starch, dense with prebiotic fiber chains, the kind of complex carbohydrate that, in healthy days, would have prompted 3 separate well committees. The spotic front had noted it with interest and done nothing, because the general understood the gut primarily as a territory to be occupied. He was less attentive to the ecosystem to be managed. The legumes sat in the colic holding area, unclaimed, waiting. Carlo had known what they were there for the moment they had arrived. I can get to them, he told Celine. How? The guards. The guards are gram-negative bacteria in a moderately acidic environment with limited food. I'm a complex carbohydrate chain with a working knowledge of the entire colonic layout. He looked at her sadly. They were watching the exit. Nobody's watching the lethal interior because no one thinks the interior is strategically important. A pause. It's important. Carlo moved through the compound's interior wall with the confidence of something had spent its entire life navigating hostile environments. That was the entire point of the resistant starch. It was passing through the small intestine intact and arrives in a large intestine ready to do its actual work. The compound's walls were, molecularly speaking, no more challenging. He emerged into the colonic corridor. The legume shipments hit exactly where he had felt it, a dense aromatic collection of complex fiber chains sitting in the upper colon, guarded by exactly nobody. He worked quickly. He found the surviving biotophyte bacterium colony in the ascending colon, depleted, thin, holding on to a quiet stubbornness of organisms that they had been here longer than most anything else, and he began to feed them. The response was almost immediate, not dramatic. It never was. The quieter, more fundamental response of a living thing given that they needed. They even began to multiply, slowly at first, then faster. Fermentation started, and deep, rhythmic processes of beneficial bacteria consuming complex carbohydrates and producing short-chain fatty acids as a byproduct. The butyrate had begun to accumulate. Lactic acid was dropping the local pH. Molecular signals started moving through the gut wall towards the immune cells waiting just underneath. And then the cecal compound, Patty felt it. It was working, she said softly. She could sense the pH shifting, the fine awareness of environmental chemistry that was part of what she was. The fermentation is running. The guards, Cillian said. She was watching 3 Klebsiella posted at the entrance. Gram-negative bacteria in an acidifying environment were not happy gram-negative bacteria. The shift was small, fractions of pH units, but she could see it in the way they moved. A slight sluggishness, a reduced efficiency in the way that they held their positions. Paris had been waiting for exactly this. He rose from his corner of the compound, slowly, carefully, and walked to the center. He was carrying something he had been quietly simmering for 72 hours from the protein residue in the compound's wall. A dense structural chain, thick, load-bearing, the kind of thing you might use if you needed to as the battering ram. He looked at Celine. She nodded. The compound torque gave to the third impact. Pereira had the kind of protein-based determination that tends eventually to overcome the most physical obstacles. The Klebsiella guards, slowly by the acid shift, found that their weapons required a healthy metabolism to operate, and their metabolism was at the moment somewhat reduced. Fatty was through the door before it was fully opened. Carlo had already moved outside and had been outside and was running. Viveth, Viveth, he called out. The acromencilia are in the middle colon. If the butyrate reaches them in the next 20 minutes, the mucus layer starts rebuilding. We need Paris. I'm here, Paris said, falling up a pace that was fast but not absolutely relentless. The gut's lining cells need repair. I have the amino acid inventory. Just get me to the wall. Celine ran alongside, and as she was thinking about what she had to say in the appendix, we know the way. General Vlad Motorich received the news of the compound breach and the sub-officers who were already visibly struggling with the pH drop. The general felt it too, a metabolic lightning, a slightly different than the energy processing that powered his operations. He had survived acid environments before. He survived what was not the same as the thriving. And the fermentation now running through the colonic corridors was doing to his troops precisely what Fatty had described, making the environment inhospitable, one fraction of a pH unit at a time. Attacca, he said. His troops moved with the discipline of efficiency as they moved through a large intestines that was, in each passing minute, becoming more acidic, more colonized, more competing organisms, more reinforced by a mucus layer that was visible, measurably beginning to thicken. The acmencia, fed by butyrate, was rebuilding. The mucus was reforming. The gut lining cells now received Paris amino acids deliveries through the repaired wall and were sealing the connections, shutting the gut lining against inflammatory penetration. And from the appendix, the stubborn, much dismissed reserve, the seed of the colonies were flowing outward. The lactobacterium, the bifidobacterium, the fecal bacterium, the full biodiversity of the healthy gut, patient and intact, emerging in an environment that was, for the first time in months, becoming hospitable again. The general advanced. He was not by an army, but he could have dealt with an army. But it was an ecosystem. By the sheer proliferating, acid-producing, fermentation-running, mucus-thickening, biological pressure of a microbiome beginning to function as if it was meant to function. He was an excellent general, but he was also underneath everything, a bacterium. And bacteria live or die by their environment. The environment was changing. He gave the order. to fall back. Aftermath and society's recovery. The weeks that followed were not triumphant. Celine was clear-eyed about this. Victory in a gut war was not a dramatic moment. It was a slow, metabolic, expensive process of rebuilding infrastructure. The despotic front had not been eliminated. General Vladimir Goritch and his core faction had retreated to the cecal membranes, and where they had continued to exist as they always had, as a managed presence in an ecosystem that was no longer tilted in their favor. The Republic declared, cautiously, improved conditions, but the work was extraordinary. Pereira threw himself into the focused energy of someone who had spent months in a holding compound thinking about everything he wanted to build. The gut lining, damaged by months of inflammation, thinned by the loss of the mucus protection, required systematic repair. Pereira worked methodically, starting at the most critical breach points and moving outward, delivering amino acids to the cellular repair machine, ensuring that the connections between the lining cells were sealed correctly, overseeing the rebuilding of surface proteins in the small intestinal cells needed to do their absorptive work. He was assisted by the incoming protein from the diet, good protein, properly digested, arrive in the way that suggested the host above has also finally begun to change. Whoever's eating up there, Pereira said in the passing to his bow, tell them to keep it up. The Lucien delivery is among the morning. He shook his head with the reverence of a craftsman receiving exact materials. This is exactly what we need. The runner, who was too small to actually convey the message anywhere, nodded anyway and kept moving. Fatty's recovery was quieter and more personal. She spent the first day simply moving throughout the gut, throughout the mucosa, confirming the world had become navigable again. She restored the fatty soluble vitamin absorption channels. She reestablished contact with the fat transport systems and verified that the delivery routes were functioning. She had a long, complicated, and ultimately productive conversation with the Omega-3 shipment, which had been backed up all into the small intestine junction for 2 weeks and was now finally moving through. She also visited the Commissioner Fermentus, who in his cecal margins with the rest of the despotic front remnants, and who looked considerably smaller than she'd remember. You know, he said quietly in accusation, I know the biology. Vertimus looked at the thickening mucus wall, something she might generously have called respect. The fat soluble signals, the membrane integrity work, that was restoring the lining, wasn't it? It wasn't really a question. It was me doing my job, Fatty said. We could have used you. I know, she looked at him directly. You also could have used me up. There's a difference. She picked a small discard fragment of saturated fat that accumulated near the margins and the junk calories that had been feeding the front for months and held it up between them. You've been surviving on this, you know it's not enough. He said nothing. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in this gut has been completely off balance, she set a fragment down. Without the anti-inflammatory signal work, this whole place stays inflamed. Inflamed walls are more permeable walls. More permeable walls let things that shouldn't be here. She tilted her head. This includes you, Commissioner. You thrive in an inflamed gut, which means the long-term strategy is self-defeating. The more you win, the more you destroy the very conditions that allow you to win. Vertimus said after long moments. The general said it was no problem for the next campaign. Of course he does. Fatty returned to leave. It's always the next campaign. Carlo was particularly the first to celebrate. He arrived in the main colonic corridor in the morning of the third week, carrying the most glorious fiber delivery the gut had seen in 7 months. A complex treatment of garlic, onions, leeks, chicory root, dense with prebiotic fiber chains and beneficial bacteria needed most, preceded by a runner of Jerusalem artichoke that had the bifidobacterium practically vibrating with anticipation. Mes amis, he announced, the fiber has arrived. The fermentation will commence. The short-chain fatty acids will flow, and the butyric will build the wall, and the wall will hold, and the bad bacteria will simply... He made an expressive gesture suggesting metabolic suppression. The gut republic endures. The bifidobacterium erupted in what was microbial standards, a fairly enthusiastic response. The lactobacterius division raised to cheer and propagated through the lining as a wave of lactic acid. Even the acromencia, who were not given to expressiveness, thickened the mucus layer by measurable increments in what Carla chose to interpret as applause. He distributed the fiber with joy of someone who had found, after a long famine, that the work of feeding is not a burden, but a gift. This was always been his nature, to fuel, to sustain, to provide the foundation everything else was built upon. In the bad times, the gut had forgotten that. In the good times, it was simply, plainly true. The recovery parliament met 6 weeks after the breach. It was held in the mid-large intestines, neutral territory. Representatives of every major fraction had been present. The rounded conical vermicules, the slender, precise bactotorites, and the acromencia, who came in small numbers, but whose importance to the mucus wall gave them an outsized voice. The bifidobacterium restored the 60% of their formal numbers and growing daily. The fecal bacterium, whose biliary production was the gut's single most important infrastructure and service, and at the margins a small but careful watch delegation of the cecal districts representing the despotic front in their current diminished capacity. General Vlad Marichevich sent Commissioner Fermentus in his place. Fermentus arrived looking like a man who had recently lost an argument and was fairly confident he had been winning. He was flanked by 2 junior officers, a compact greasy rod named Lieutenant Lotvia, and a sharp-edged type called Sergeant Inflammia, both of whom breathed a specific resentment of people who had not been consulted before being made to attend peace proceeding. "We are here under protest," Firmus announced, but no one in particular. "You are here under observation," said one of the Bacterites delegates, not looking up from her notes. "There is distinction." Firmus sat down with the energy of a man who chose to sit down rather than being made to. Lieutenant Blotvia immediately leaned towards Sergeant Inflammia. "They outnumber us 4-1, he muttered. "They outnumbered us 3 trillion to 1, Inflammia replied, in a flat voice of someone who had done the math, who was not pleased by it. Celine opened the session standing at the center of the parliament floor, her indigo colony coat restored to its proper shade, the slightly worn quality of reading it, not its diminishment, but its evidence of everything had survived. "We are here," she said simply, "to discuss what comes next, not to celebrate what's past." A murmur of acknowledgement. But to think about the conditions we need to maintain and how to maintain them, and what we do differently when the conditions begin to slip. Paris spoke about the protein supply and the importance of adequate dietary protein arriving in properly digestible form. He spoke about the connection between the gut lining and the immune system, and how a well-fed, well-prepared lining was the first and best defense against inflammation flare-ups. He spoke with a considerable feeling about how the gut was not just a digestive organ, but a mood, a nervous system that had its constant conversation with the brain. "Triumphane," he said. 90% of the body's serotonin is made there. If the lining is compromised, if the absorption is disrupted, if the conversation between the gut and the brain goes quiet, and a quiet gut, he paused, is not a healthy gut. Lieutenant Blow raised a hand. "Question. If your lining is so essential, how did it fall apart in the first place?" A moment of tension settled over the room. "Because the fibers stopped coming," Perry said eventually. "Which you know because your faction benefited from it." "We benefited from conditions," Blotov said. "We didn't create the conditions." "No," said Fatty, but far from the end of the table without looking up. "You just made sure to be ready when they arrived, which in fairness is what any competent organism does." She looked up. "The question of this parliament is not who benefited from the breakdown. The question is how do we build a system that's harder to break?" Fermentus made a sound that was not quite a scoff. "And you think a charter will accomplish that?" "A charter doesn't accomplish anything," Fatty said pleasantly. "The conditions accomplish it. The charter just reminds everyone what the conditions are." She looked at Fermentus steadily. "Unless you're suggesting that you have a better idea." Fermentus had, it turned out, no better idea. He subsided. Fatty spoke about lipids, not at length, but with precision. The membrane integrity of every cell in the gut wall, the phospholipid layers that kept cell contains in and hostile things out, the anti-inflammatory properties of omega-3 fats, and how the absence had left the immune system in a state of permanent, exhausting overactivation. An inflamed gut, she said, is not a protected gut. It is a gut that is fighting itself. A gut that is fighting itself, she glanced at Fermentus, is a gut that is losing regardless of which bacteria are winning. Sergeant Flannery stirred this. The inflammation benefits our sides are significant, he said. There was something almost academic in his delivery, as though he was reporting a research finding. Yes, Fatty said, because the host considered it with pain. You're proud of that? Anthony considered this with an expression of someone who had genuinely not thought about it in those terms. It is not the goal, he said finally. It was an outcome. Outcome, said Fatty's, or what you are remembered for. Carlo's contribution was brief and comprehensive. He held up for the assembly representatives a single resistant starch molecule. Nothing fancy, nothing processed, nothing stripped of its fiber, and he said, feed us this, feed the good bacteria this, everything else follows. And if the host doesn't, said Blotov. Carlo looked at them, and then back in the middle of the colon. He sat in this room again for about 4 months. He shrugged. He'd been done it before. He'll do it again. He looked at the resistant starch in his hand. But the good bacteria have longer memories than you think, and every time we recover, we get a little better at it. Blotov opened his mouth, and then usually closed it again. The Parliament voted to establish the conditions for continual recovery. A charter outlining the dietary requirements, the microbiome maintenance protocols, early warning indicators that have been so catastrophically ignored in the months before the war. It is a boring document in a way that all genuine, useful operational documents are boring. A list of fermentation targets and pH maintenance benchmarks that read like a manual for a well-run town, which Celine reflected was exactly what it was. Fermentus signed the charter with the elaborate reluctance of a man who disagreed with the outcome but recognized that he'd run out the moves. He handed the pen back without comment. Celine watched him go. She thought about the easy thing to feel, which was satisfaction. A more complicated thing she actually felt was something more like respect. Not admiration, not anything close to admiration, but the honest acknowledgement that the despotic front had survived the same catastrophes that had nearly destroyed the good colonies, and done so by being very good at exactly one thing. They were relentless. They were adaptive. They would be back, and the Republic would be waiting. The evening after the Parliament, the four of them sat together in their favorite stretch of the small intestines, well-maintained structural sound. A view down the village corridor always reminded Celine of what the place was supposed to be. The gut was quiet. Not the silence of crisis, the deep, productive, metabolic, busy quiet of an ecosystem doing its job. Somewhere in the large intestines, the bacterium were fermenting. In the small intestines, various absorption systems were running their overnight cycles, and through the mucosa, the fatty lipid channels were processing the evening's fat-soluble deliveries. And in the colonic depths, Carlo's complex carbohydrate chains were feeding colonies that were hour by hour growing stronger. Do you think he'll try again? Carlo asked. He meant the general. Eventually, Celine said. When the conditions allowed, she paused. She counted the hosts, forgetting. They usually do, eventually. So we remind them, Perry said. It was not coming from him, a political statement. It was a craftsman note to remind them to maintain the work. We do our jobs, Fatty said. 3 words. Contain multitudes. The comfortable silence settled between them. Somewhere in the colonic corridor, a bacterium was producing butyrate. The mucus layer cells absorbed it, and the gut wall thickened by a fraction. And the connections between the lining cells were reinforced, and the wall held. Below the line, the immune cells received their molecular briefing and concluded correctly that the conditions were stable. The long nerve that ran between the gut and the brain carried its signals north. Above, in the world outside the gut, the hosts felt nothing of this in any conscious way. They felt perhaps a vague but genuine sense of well-being, an appetite that was functioned correctly, an absence of cramping and bloating that had characterized the past months, energy that had arrived and stayed the day without chaotic peaks and crashings of the system running into refined sugar and bad luck. They felt in a particular wordless language of the body working as it should. Fine. Just fine. Which was, as anyone who'd ever lived through an alternate world will tell you, an extraordinary thing. Celine sat in her villas and listened to the sound of 3 trillion organisms going through their business. And she thought about Ferrari's hands, how they moved when they talked about tryptophan, with the reverence she'd always had found slightly funny, and now found the retrospective exactly right. She thought about Carlos singing that carbohydrate folk song in the colon at midnight, herding resistant starch like it was a precious cargo, which it was. She thought about fatty in the margins of fermenters, explaining the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio to the commissioner, who had never had to think about it with the patience Celine herself did not possess. She took a slow breath of the colonic air, slightly acidic, warm with the metabolic heat of trillions of living organisms, and let it out. The fermentation ran. The boulderate built the wall. The wall held. Bonne année, Republique.